How about more info regarding how life uses thoughts, verbalization, and intellect in ways never suspected by man until now. Now that some of this information will be available to you, privacy of your own home, thanks to, what should we call it, loudmouth dynamics. How about let's start back one I had in mind, the one about everything exists locally. You remember that? I wanted to expand some, and this has nothing to do with the example I was going to use, but it's again unknowingly indicative of what's going on in the midst of everyone, and vice versa. Analyzed, talked about, written about, and never actually seen anywhere closer to its more complex dimensions. Everything exists locally. Now there have been, continue to be, certain kind of fascination, a certain kind of attraction, and none of those words are exclusive because they overlap. It's simply the energy, but there is a kind of fascination not only with that which seems to be primitive, but there is a little more subtle fascination in this regard of less primitive people. That is, let us say, a Western anthropologist, if I have to make a crude example, and the kinds of people who might read about it or to see a man speak. The fascination seems to be in the areas of them questioning certain of the primitive people's activities, certain of their ideas, speech. They'll find some tribe that the people, they can talk. They've already seen TV cameras now, and they don't fall on the floor or on the ground and hide from cameras. But they talk to these primitive people, and this, I just sort of make up a composite. And they'll talk to this one tribe, and the tribe says that there's no doubt, let us say they live by the ocean, that there's no doubt that periodically certain of the sharks around there take on human form, become sexually aggressive, and get some of the women in the village pregnant. Not only the anthropologists now, we're talking about life's body, remember, that parts of life's body growing at one temporal speed and other parts growing at other speeds and up to other activities. So the other parts is exemplified by anthropologists or exemplified by you reading about this. You being further exemplary of a larger segment of fairly sane, civilized people. It's not just the fascination with the primitive now, because we've been through that on more than one occasion. But what I want you to hear is the entanglement that goes on within part of life's nervous system, flowing through man's intellect, over questions such as this. There's this story. They get the chief, and he tells a story, and they say, we've heard about this. Now you're saying that these sharks, the particular ones, and the chief may say, well, yes, in fact it's the sharks, and he may now know the Latin name. He says, the ones you people call so-and-so. And we've been calling them the such-and-such sharks. And they say, okay, but you're telling me that those sharks sometimes take on a human form. He says, not only human form, it's always male. He said, okay. And they come out of the water. Yes, they come out of the water, and they will attack sexually some of the women of the village. And it is not unknown for them to become impregnated by this occurrence. And this intellect, an anthropologist, let's say. Well, see, now, and then the question seems to be presented, if not outright in the book, or if the man was doing a TV documentary, then the intrigue I'm trying to get you to is not just the primitiveness itself, but then they become involved with the questions. Do these people actually believe that? And what I was trying to indicate by my little made-up scenario is there the camera is on this guy, and he may be wearing less than a Brooks Brothers suit, but he can now maybe even speak a little English, or at least someone's translating, and he seems to be well aware of what the anthropologist, the interviewer, is asking. He may even show little glimmers that may sound, you might try to interpret as some sort of irony, like, well, I know you don't believe it. But he presents the story straightforward. They question him a little bit, that you're actually saying it's the sharks. They actually come out. Oh, yeah. So then the question becomes to the intellect of a less primitive, of a more, just in the general scheme of things, complex person. Do they actually believe that, or is it a metaphor for something else? Or are they simply so primitive and backwards that their intellectual capacities, they're just operating at the level of childish dreams and nightmares? That about covers the possibilities an ordinary intellect would hit. Whatever temporary answer or general theory that any particular anthropologist or interviewer might come up with is not the point. The point is that you should be, anybody interested in this, you should still, as always, have enough of your nervous system that is mainstream, besides the weirdness that brought you within my purview, but the mainstream enough to hear what I'm saying, that you can become very interested in this and find it to be a perplexing problem. Maybe not going to change your life, but that it may hold out some great promise. Because then, from what I'm trying to, if I hadn't made it clear enough, it is a small step from that to having a real, not just intellectual, but having a real interest in mythology, let's say. The whole mythology, not just of the classic Greeks or Romans or whatever, but worldwide mythology, of the stories everywhere, as to why these relatively, of course they're primitive compared to us, they do not have electricity and etc., but the people are not idiots. I mean, something is strange here, because I can talk to the chief, and not just the chief, but some of the other people, and they'll look me dead in the eye. They can talk, they know what a shark is. I can tell them that where I come from, I've drawn little maps, and they know I'm not from around here. And I say, we've never heard of that. I have personally never seen, and I've been around a lot of places, I have never seen a shark become a human. And they'll nod like, well, okay. They don't call me an idiot. They don't get real defensive like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. They just say, well, okay, if you never have. And then they might even add, well, there's some people in the village that's actually never seen it, and which will really throw you. It's a small step, and it's the way life is wired up, to have a real interest. And then, of course, I want you to see that there is a kind of low-level need that gets fed by this energy. It's not just intellectual, but an interest in the possible, complex, alternative answers, theories, as to what may be going on in these more primitive structures, intellectually, not just socially. And so you become seriously hungry and interested in these primitive ideas, and it is not simply limited to stories of sharks taking on human form. You people should be big enough now not to get upset for me to point out that it's the same thing true of the Old Testament, the New Testament, all the Hindu writings and the Buddha baskets and everything else. You're talking about primitive ideas. But they're not dead. They're not gone. They are not seen as being the dead-end streets they are, contraire. They seem open, and in many cases, the more complex you are, that is, in the ordinary sense, the more sophisticated, the more educated, the more likely, in the same way as me pointing out that it's only the educated people that will go pay $22 to see a play about a Stanley Kowalski. The Stanley Kowalskis wouldn't pay 50 cents to see it. It is not primitive people that hear about some other primitive people's mythology. To begin with, they're primitive enough, they're not going to have occasion to hear anybody else's. But if you showed up in one village, and so you know that story you told me last time I was here about sharks taking on human form, the guy says, yeah. So I brought you a book. We've been gathering other stories from other places, and there's some other places that they have the kind of stories, but it's about turtles, and they become accountants on certain times. Now, if this first village with the shark story, if they were civilized people, the chief might say, well, thank you so much. And when he left, he'd throw it under his bed if he had a bed, because he's not interested in reading about that. He wouldn't find it, he might find it interesting just for a second about, oh, really? But he would not take it as being perhaps open to some great interpretation that would be some new enlightenment to him. I mean, if you already got sharks attacking women there, you know, you got to compete with sharks every now and then to get laid. Who cares about some other group that you're never going to run across that's got turtles that become accountants, you know, when the moon's just right? In the ordinary sense of the word of being sophisticated and wired up in a more complex way, it is those who are more complex who would find that these kinds of primitive ideas, and then the question is what I'm afraid that some of you still haven't seen. It's not just the idea, but then the observer, that is the complex person, the anthropologist is the example. It's not just the ideas, these primitive ideas, but then it gets to be the person, the observer, their reaction to, how can this be? Those people, can they really believe that? They're certainly, culturally, technically, behind us, but hell, they're exposed, they're here, they know they're posing for cameras, they've seen videos played back, they're not idiots. They know, they've already had other people tell them that outside this place, this one area, no one else has ever seen a shark turn into a human. Why do they keep saying that? Do they believe that? And they may again ask, say, have you actually seen this yourself? The guy said, well, sure I have. Why would I tell you? I didn't say it was a tale. I said it happens. It's not a story. There's a difference between stories and actually what happens. And so you're telling me you have seen this happen. Yeah. The intrigue is not just in the story. That's fairly simple and straightforward. It then becomes the intrigue into how should I interpret this? That these more primitive tales have got to be open, which they are, have got to be open to very exotic interpretations, which of course they're just begging for it. But no matter how cute they may be, the stories, no matter how open they may be immediately to some more esoteric, metaphysical, metaphoric interpretation, they're useless. Which is not the point of me bringing it up, but for somebody attempting to do this, they're useless. But notice, life is wired up in such a way that that doesn't strike people as correct. It can't be useless. I mean, the stories, forget about sharks and all that if you want to move up a little bit. How about stories, even if you didn't take it as historical, it's historically valid. How about stories of a Moses taking downtrodden people, and we could look at it as people who needed some new information and took them from a barren place where the information was old and outdated and primitive and led them to a new place. Isn't that wonderful? It's useless if it's primitive. And you don't have to analyze primitive. If you do, you need more than this. You need an elementary school education. If it's primitive, it's useless for this. There is no way to profitably interpret it. Now, I don't mean it couldn't be a hobby. It could be a vocation even. You could become an anthropologist. But to believe that anything that is more primitive than you are, the information, just on the surface, that is more primitive than you, there is no further question. There is no question as, especially this, I was nice enough not to even point out this possibility, speaking for ordinary intelligence. That is, the possibility that this actually happens, that sharks here, how else can we explain it? There could be some kind of crimp. I guess I have to be an anthropologist that had been, his mother affected by Ray Bradbury or somebody, to believe there's, whatever they'd call it, some kind of crimp somewhere in the cultural fabric of the universe in such a way that although us, me and the cameraman, the sound man, us intellectual, reasonable men, we know that sharks can't do that. But what if, in a place where they don't know that, it can happen? That is, that it's not metaphorical, and they're not nuts, that it actually happens here, but since we don't believe it, since our reality is locally based in another part of the planet, we don't believe it, and therefore we couldn't see it if it happened. But what if it actually happens even? See, I was nice enough not to even throw that in. For those of you who were thinking, when I pointed out 3 possibilities, I don't even want to consider myself that some of you went, wait a minute, you left out the possibility it actually happens. There is no way to profitably interpret that. And I'm not trying to save you people energy so that you won't go out and try to read the, if there is such a thing as a full collection of the Vedic literature, which I guess you and 20,000 people would have to work in gang readings to ever read it. It's not just to save you the time or to save you from going back and deciding that there's all kinds of hidden messages in the Old Testament. You got to do something. You might as well read that as watch TV if you just need a hobby. But to believe that there is a way to profitably interpret something that is more primitive than you are shows how primitive you are. Because it is not possible. Now I'll repeat one more time, that does not mean that you might not enjoy it. But to believe that there is actually some way, any possible way, to interpret that which is more primitive than you are, the information, the basis of the energy, the ideas, if it is more primitive than you, is part of the backward history. It is dead. It is useless to you. There is no way to properly interpret it other than if you want to make a metaphor out of it and go, hey, and it might give you a real quick brain smile. But insofar as you believe that there is anything that you could take from that that would be of practical value, that you could take something, even metaphorically to start with, and then turn it into a ritual, or some way to alter your behavior by doing this, you are now as primitive as they are. Of course, you're worse, but I don't want to try to explain that. Maybe some of you understand that by now. It's like, you know, if a dog is just a dog, he can be cute. Because he doesn't know he's cute, right? And then the voice, though, it speaks up and says, wait a minute, but that's the very thing that makes humans cute, is they think they can be cute. Telling it twice didn't help, did it? I guess that's because you people are so cute. Try this. This is, in fact, another in the list of unrecognized cosmic laws. Let me say it and I'll decide whether we should say any more about it. If I do it right, it's going to cover everything, whether you hear it or not. No, everything about what we're talking about now. The proof of something's existence is in the fact that you or someone questioned its existence. Oh, all right. Back to my example. That you, let us say, you don't have to be the anthropologist there, that you're watching some PBS special and it's on this tribe. And they spend an hour talking to people and it keeps flowing through there the stories about the sharks. It shows up in other ways, and so your memory of it continues to be jogged through the hour show, and somebody's always asking. Somebody bring it back up. They'll be talking about the crops or something, and one guy that's there, maybe they're interpreting for him, but he seems reasonable under the circumstance. And he's saying, well, one thing about the crops is we have noticed, and we know something about the movements of the heavens and planning. Obviously they do, they're eating. And he says, but we have noticed one thing. There seems to be some correlation, if they had such a word, between the times that we have a real spate of those attacks, that is, the sharks becoming humans and attacking some of our women, that always has an adverse. So suddenly it pops up again. And there's a guy saying this, and maybe the interviewer says, are you serious, you guys have kept track? Oh, yeah. Well, because we don't like it when one of these sharks becomes that, because then we all got to watch our women, and somebody may show up pregnant, and it's not one of us. And so we, of course, take notice every time this happens. We haven't. It does not happen regularly enough for us to schedule it. It's not like once a month or once a year, but when it does happen, we do note, and we've also noted that every time that happens, we have a bad crop. And so there you are again thinking, well, damn, these people are not nuts, but how can they keep saying that when it's not true? Do you hear? And you're questioning, good grief, how can they believe that? The proof of something's existence is in the fact that you, or anybody, but in this case it's you, which is the only thing that should interest you, is that you're questioning its existence. That is the proof. There is nowhere else to look. Or I'll refer you back to my other one, is locally, everything exists. It's not in question. The only question is, can you use it? Is the information functional for you? And if it's more primitive than you are, you can't. I must give you, since it's free, my opinion, that most of you are up against what I've been talking about and you still don't see it. It's real simple. Except you're not supposed to see it. Anything that's more primitive than you is not functional. And life is wired up in such a way that even those people who believe that they're interested in some sort of unusual information, additional information that may not be forthcoming from the regular channels in life, they will look in exactly the incorrect place. You are wired up to be attracted to that which is primitive, that is more primitive than you, which is the only thing that matters. Primitive is not any sort of clinical or objective description of it. But if it's more primitive than you, and you've got any question as to its validity, there is its validity. Those less complex than this one tribe, that is, we've got one tribe, let's call them primitive -1. Then if there was somebody primitive -2, and they were more primitive, they would have no interest. They would not question somebody who is less primitive, the validity of what they're saying. Well, I thought that might help. Do you not find it interesting? Surely you hear a little of that. How, and it's no modern day phenomenon, how the more complex, the more well-read, the more educated people are, the more they are attracted to primitive ideas. Now forget what excuse they have, like, well, it's clinical or it's academic. Never mind all that. It's just a fact. Don't you find that interesting? And if it gets into the more specific area of those who really believe that they are on some great intellectual or spiritual quest to get some sort of new information somewhere, secret information, where do they look? What are they drawn to? That which is more primitive than they are. And they're also wired up, if somebody jumped out of the bushes and tried to make some critique of this, like, well, hey, you seem to be pretty sharp and you seem to be interested in certain ideas, and may I give you a piece of advice? Don't be fooling around with ideas that are more primitive than you are. Ha! That ha, of course, is a one-word retelling, recalling of the downfall of man. That is, at once we were better off when we were more primitive. In some way we have fallen uphill and we're not any better for it. And if there's some way to make progress, it'd be to be able to go backwards. To go back to a day of grace. To be more primitive. That's it. We could put other terms on it, but that is it. That is the basic call of the wild for people who believe that there might be some secret information. They don't have to be all weird and spooky, although I'm not discounting that. But people who believe that there's got to be more to life than's around the surface. Where do they believe that more is? They will end up, if not going there themselves, reading about, watching shows, dreaming about, talking to some guy who believes that sharks, their local reality is that sharks can become humans. To believe, take any story you want to from any religion, to believe that those things not only happened, which of course they did happen somewhere, they happened in some local reality somewhere, not only that, but that it would now be profitable to pursue it. course, I'm amazed at times. It's nobody's business, I guess. Of the many laughs that life has at our expense. Oh, I'll bet among the other lives when they get together, I bet our life tries to call it something else. Yeah, I know how that kind of stuff goes. Probably calls it some kind of test or some kind of evolutionary process. But be that as it may, I can tell you what. Much of this, you just have to trust me. Verges on being real thigh slappers to life. Well, let's see if we can pull it in a slightly different direction. If we were to go back to a kind of battlefield scenario, trying to do whatever this is as a kind of revolutionary activity, and even back to the ordinary level of most people feeling that life is indeed some sort of struggle. But at any rate, if we were dealing with a more complex, not just the ordinary, but the more complex battlefield scenario, then local reality could be given another name. Since I gave it its first one, I'll give it another one. Local reality could be called, and I quote, the enemies of information. From the view of trying to gather new information from ways that are not wired to be forthcoming with any nourishment, then local reality is of its very nature the enemy of new information. You don't want to connect all the dots yourself? You understand what that means? It means that anything that's real to you under normal conditions is the enemy of new information. It's that simple. The enemy. That'd make a good name for I guess it'd be a religion, would it? An anti-religion? Some kind of group? The enemies of new information. Of course, come to think about it, I guess they already got that. It's known as the right wing of the Republican Party, the far right. No. The Masons, I don't know. All local reality is, look at from the battlefield picturization, would be the enemy of information. But then I could ask you, since most of you seem to put your hands on that piece a little bit, then I'd have to ask you this. Why would a revolutionary intelligent man, that is a newly intelligent person, a person who had some intelligence going inside the brain beyond the ordinary limits, why would such a person ever be their own enemy? The basis of that question is that if you had some extraordinary intelligence, that is, if you just had your brain operating chemically, operating to the point that it could talk back to you, that you could understand the new chemistry of your brain in an area that was not natural, if it was functioning, that is, so that you would be what I was calling a holder of revolutionary intelligence, do you not see that this kind of intelligence itself would be temporally synonymous with information? I'll see if I can iron it out. Just verbally, right quick. It should have been more direct than that. If local reality is synonymous with that now infamous group, the enemies of new information, and then I ask you, why would someone with revolutionary, higher brain, new brain operations functioning, why would they ever be their own enemy, comma, do you not see that new intelligence is synonymous with new information? Synonymous with. It's not that new intelligence has new information. Well, you can say that one split second before it has it, but after that it's too late. You might as well call in Dr. Heisenberg and show him how to expand his own little theory. Because we can beat him, not just the principle of uncertainty. It's to show him that the principle of uncertainty is pretty suspect itself. It's hard to pin it right down. In other words, it's kind of uncertain, don't you see? But as long as you're dealing with local reality, do you not see, back to my rhetorical question, that you would be operating as an enemy to yourself, not just an enemy to new information, but you would be operating as an enemy to yourself if you're attempting to do something, whatever this is. Anytime you're supporting your local reality, you are an enemy of new information. There's no way around it. You are a living enemy of new information. And it doesn't matter what your local reality is. Because all local reality is enemy of new information. How about some additional information? How about an example of the real tricky use of words, and even the reality that words are purported to represent that life uses on man? Since I brought up the battlefield picturization again. Losers get the most out of wars. Something to talk about. History. All right, now, the first part of that sentence, even all of it, if you didn't make a quantum jump to another orbit, is absolutely insane, is it not? That losers get the most from wars. We might as well just close up the tape and everybody go home. But any of you who have any possibility of seeing can see that that is the truth. We are in a prime example. This part of the world is the Civil War, known in some parts the war between the states. You fool around south of the Dixie Cup line, and intelligent people, educated people, as they're called, writers, educators, will almost drive you nuts talking about the Civil War. That this one group down here, of course you can't say much more than they lost, but they lost in a big way. They unconditionally lost. Losers get the most out of wars, though. Then put a dash. They get something to talk about. The winners, you don't ever hear people up north. Unless it's in some response. There is no mystique to the war. They do not talk about how it still haunts their culture and their dreams and how it's affected their literature and their music. And yet you grab somebody from the University of Alabama or Tennessee, some guy with a PhD in psychology or sociology, and you ask him something about the Civil War and he'll go, yes. And he'll begin to whine on about how it has subconsciously permeated all of this region. It has affected in unbelievable ways the literature, the sexual mores. He'll go on, and what's he talking about? He's talking about everything they got out of losing that war. I repeat, on the surface, to ordinary intelligence, my opening comment with this paragraph, insane hardly covers it, does it? that losers get the most out of wars. Now, surely all of you can think back at your own history, and do you not see at the three-dimensional level, which is the only place our kind of wars can happen, you got two groups, you got two systems, you got two organizations, you've got this collection of living molecular structures. They engage in this dance that involves overt aggression, bloodshed, death. It gets through, and one side is announced the winner. And theoretically, if not to some practice, but hold it a second, have their way. The other group has to surrender. All right, what's the conditions? And normally, the winning side says, to hell with the conditions, you just surrender, and we'll work it out later. So, and that's normally the way it works in modern times, well, in all times. So then you think, well, they unconditionally surrendered, so now the winning side can just do anything they want to. They can just demand anything they want to, which sometimes they do immediately. They sit right down and demand, all right, you got to pay us back 40 billion zorts to make up for all this, and you got to send us half of your good-looking women. And they say all this stuff. And the losers say, all right. And they do it, but notice this. The next day, oh, that's forgotten. If not the next day, the next week. A month from now. It's forgotten as far as the winners. They just forget about it. Not the losers, because the losers are the ones who got the most from the war, from losing. They got history, but they specifically got something to talk about. Now, may I ask you to turn your attention inwardly. Now, I know what you're thinking. Not only was my statement about losers, when I apparently was actually talking about wars, insane, notice that the human nervous system, the brain, the intellect, is wired up in such a way that you don't even have to give it any analyzation about how insane it is if it had to do with you personally, the kind of struggles that we all go through with ourselves. But what if it's not insane? Think right quick. Does that not explain not only why people can't change, but let's assume that that's incorrect, that they can change. But they change, and it don't mean squat. They're not impressed by it. They don't like it. Because the part that changes seems to be the part that prevailed. And I repeat again, you never ask somebody up north or mention the Civil War and then begin to wax poetically and have anything to say about it. Other than, well, what the hell you want? And we want it. I mean, is that what's the point? That does not sound familiar when you apparently have done something yourself, overcome a bad habit, made some change. That, all right, I'm going to start getting up. I don't care what happens. I'm going to start getting up at 5:30 and I'm going to run 3 miles. I don't care if it's snowing. I'll get me some Michelin shoes and I'll run in the snow. You can say that. And then you're back into one of the popular areas I know you all like, that you're back into the numerous, sundry, and various dynamics of telling yourself what kind of guy you are. I'm the kind of guy that was able to do this. Once you have apparently won, where's the fun in it? There is no history to winning. There is no mystique. Do you not see the humor in this, that life, if it is arranged in such a way that will make people, or allow some people to apparently change and overcome something, if they do, it's not much fun. They forget about it. And when they don't, or the part that didn't, if it in some way gets revived enough or speaks up inside your own brain, it's the losers that verbally and culturally and artistically tap dance in your nervous system, and they're the ones that lost. That's almost a double dice sniper, I suggest to you, on the last part. Do you not see? I mean, it's not hurting you, but do you not see that no matter whether you win or lose, you lose? I hate to be that crude, but some of you are not snapping to tonight. So I was going to be more subtle and say something like, you know, even if whether you win or lose, it's still $1.98. But that is at least three-dimensional. That's closer to what ordinary people would take as being the general area toward which I am attempting to point. That is, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, you lose. Because if you lose, it seems that you got something that you didn't have before, because now you got something to talk about. And if you win, and it's brought to your attention, or that is, you bring it to your own attention, like, boy, what a great life I've led, and all the canals and little mountains that I've conquered, and all the things I've overcome, all the little ant hills that I have turned into smaller ant hills. Yeah? So what? You don't see the humor? That if it was a battlefield, if it is a contest, there's no way you can win. Because if you win, you lose. If you lose, you lose. Except if you lose, at least you got something to talk about. Well, I'll tell you the kind of guy I am. I'm the kind of guy that's always had it hard. Oh, sometimes I seem to make a little progress, and then I'll be down. Just like the whole weight of the universe just comes down on me again. All right, let me give you one more. I think we should note, since I've never brought this up, that there are two particular odors related to people talking about themselves. And of course others, but primarily about themselves. Two! Count them. It's not the double mint twins. Two different odors regarding people talking about themselves. Odor number one. Odor number one is in people bragging about secondary things they have accomplished. The odor being that secondary affairs, by their own definition, are not absolutely important to life. Now, you don't have to be an overt critic to somebody doing this. And I'm not saying that you should be snickering at everybody who points out some accomplishment they've seemed to have achieved in their avocations and their hobbies and interest in life. But there is a particular kind of odor when people are really telling you what kind of guy they are, that is, what they've accomplished, and it is, by my operational maps of dividing up life into primary and secondary activities, when it's in a secondary activity, there's just no doubt about it. There is a particular effluvium to it on the basis that, well, that's okay, but you didn't have to. You could have lived without doing that. Now you might be interested for a minute, like, well, that's kind of interesting. But when they actually go as far as they brag, that is, they really get into telling you what kind of guy they are, and what they're telling you is the kind of guy they are is on the basis, is tied to, based on, seems to be inseparable to the secondary activity accomplishment. When, it wasn't necessary. You could have lived without doing that. All right. Maybe when I give you the second one, this will make a little more sense. The second odor is in people boasting about some achievement, something that they did that was basic, simple, inescapable, primary activity like parenthood. That's the second kind. As James Brown would say if they'd let him do interviews, think about it. You still say I've got to run it up to an hour every time? I mean, first it was going too long. They made me get tapes going from an hour and a half to an hour. Well, then we've done that now for, what, a couple of weeks. And now they say, well, could you run it right up to an hour, because it really, logistically, is mucking things up to just run it 45 or 50 or 55 minutes. They even went down to 55, so if you could take it right up to the hour. Okay, well, let's repeat the first 10 minutes of tonight's tape. How about some additional, more complex information regarding how life through man uses the intellect, verbalization, in ways ordinarily unrecognized. Specifically, locally, everything exists. Of course, what's funny and not funny, if I kept this up, and most people continue to take notes and to listen. And I could repeat the first 10 minutes and nobody noticed. Well, to keep those who are in charge of logistics around here on their toes, I'm going ahead and stop.